I am reading excerpts from Bad Shepherds, the Dark Years in Which the Faithful Thrived, While Bishops Did the Devil's Work, by Bennett. On this podcast, I'm actually reading through a hardcover book, and I think I find that slows me down compared to using the locations on a Kindle reader. But anyway, starting at page 7. Here's what kept me pressing ahead. When the Archangel Gabriel announced the coming of Jesus our Savior, he told Blessed Mary, "He will be great, and will be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give to him the throne of his father David," from Luke 1. We learn two neglected facts here. Number one, that Jesus' new gospel kingdom is going to be God's Old Testament kingdom renewed and reborn. And two, that all of us Christians are citizens of that endless kingdom, the house of Jacob. And even today, Jesus sits on a throne that originally belonged to David, king of the Hebrews. All fine and good. But the more you know about the Hebrew kings who succeeded to that throne, the more astonishing these truths become. Out of 39 kings, all told, ruling over a kingdom divided into northern and southern parts, 31 were bad, 7 spectacularly so. Rehoboam, David's grandson, set up golden calves for the people to worship and deliberately caused the civil war his fathers had feared. Ahab persecuted the prophet Elijah and, quote, sold him to do what was evil in the sight of the Lord, on urge of his wife, Jezebel. That's from 1 Kings 21. Manasseh was a mass murderer who put an altar to Baal in Yahweh's temple, and later burned one of his sons there as sacrifice to Molech. 31 out of the 39, and this from a line of kings that God himself had promised to, quote, establish, make sure forever, from 2 Samuel 7. Certainly, our batting average in the Catholic Church is, at the very least, a bit higher than that. Of the total number of popes to date, for instance, 266 across a span of more than 2,000 years, fewer than 24 have been mixed up in serious wrongdoing. So I did find that personally very helpful with all these hideous revelations coming out, from Vigano regarding Cardinal McCarrick and all the things that keep coming out in the news. Bernardine being a Satanist, molesting a 7-year-old boy, involving the sacrament at St. Mary's Church in North Carolina, and on it goes. So if you need to be more up to date on that, I recommend listening to Church Militant, The Vortex, Michael Voris, and Marshall Taylor on YouTube. But it was very encouraging to me as I was reading through my Bible, actually coming across all these awful judges and awful kings, realizing that, this is the nation Israel, God's chosen people, and through whom the Messiah came. And it was loaded with evil. That was helpful. So I hope this book, as I read just some passages from it, will be encouraging to you to realize that maybe it's time to take your rose-colored glasses off. And we've been blessed with decades of some good popes, and we've been sheltered somewhat in America. But as you look the world over, centuries over, through Christianity, through Judaism, you see terrible dark evil. And it's always been there, and it always will until Jesus comes back. So, not to be shocked. And not to bail ship, to jump into the ocean where certainly you will drown. All right, so page 11, from chapter 1, called Eyes of the Prize, the Arians of the 4th Century. No, what happened in the wake of the First Council of Nicaea was a hostile takeover attempt of the Church by duly ordained Catholic churchmen, using a theological novelty as a pretext for pursuing a set of entirely this-worldly ends. Called Arianism, it was a heresy weaponized against the existing church of pre-Constantinian times, wielded by cynical, non-theological people for a wholly secular purpose. And the body count it left behind was all too literal and not metaphorical at all. Page 13. The only reason Arianism is remembered at all is that certain political figures chose that system and conspired with certain Christian clergymen to get it tolerated and then mainstreamed within the Catholic fold. For what reason? Because Arianism, ostensibly Christian though it was flexible enough and similar enough to certain brands of existing paganism to provide a refuge within the new order for unreconstructed Roman heathens. Jupiter, after all, king of the gods of the Romans, had sired half-human sons himself. Perseus, Apollo, and Hercules, and a Christian son of God, in some similar sense, might be a person to whom the pagans could swear allegiance without stepping too far out of their accustomed thought forms. Arianism was, in essence, the rump of Roman paganism trying to survive in a Christian-flavored form. As such, it was highly attractive to social engineers on both sides of the divide. So as a pope wrote an encyclical about the sin or the heresy of Americanism, we see the same sort of temptation here. Hey, can't we just all get along, coexist, and modify your faith to the popular culture so that it's palatable? That's not giving up your faith, just repackaging it, tweaking some terms, introducing some ambiguity so that, you can kind of think of it one way, but others will think maybe you're meaning something else that is acceptable. And what a great compromise. So you can have your cake and eat it too. You can be comfortable in this world and keep all your stuff and all your privilege and all your respect from your peers at work and neighbors and friends. And so you can keep this world and at the same time still, hey, you are a believing Christian, and so everything's good. It's a win-win, right? All right, on to page 19. Here's the point, however, at which God's lowly laity began to shine. The simple, dutiful man or woman in the pew was never, in any great numbers, at all fooled by any of this. The truth of the matter had been plain to them from the beginning. Arianism was a political scheme dreamed up by politicians for purposes of their own. Nothing more, nothing less. Lay people were the guinea pigs. Constantius and his ilk were the experimenters. So no doubt we have priests and bishops and cardinals, at least, within the Catholic Church, coming up with their heretical views, passing it off, being lapped up. But, as a Catholic, if you're avoiding the near occasions of sin, which to my mind anymore means just forget television, not being consumed by all the fake news you get on the mainstream media, and detaching yourself from this world in the sense of, when I say this world, I don't mean physically, but spiritually, detaching ourselves from this system that is controlled by Satan, that we don't fill our minds with this garbage, and garbage entertainment, garbage news, garbage music. Yes, you're going to look like a freak, If you want to be friends with the world, go ahead, but it certainly means you'll be enemies with God. So we have to not pollute our minds, because if we're full of lust, full of envy, full of unforgiveness, full of materialism, and seeking after more and more and better, if we're on that kind of a, hamster wheel, then we're not concerned with the things of God. We're not filled with the Holy Spirit. Fool yourself all you want, raise your hands, dance, and speak in tongues, or whatever you do, but nobody's fooled. So, also, obviously, reading through Scripture, God's Word, and going to Mass, going to confession, going to adoration, praying your rosary, just living a holy life, step by step. Of course, probably none of us are there yet. I'm certainly not. But on the right road. Well, then we have nothing to fear. Nobody can snatch us from the hands of Christ. But if you're walking in kind of a lackadaisical way, my guess is you're going to fall into accepting one thing after the other, which puts you at odds with Christ, and to be all set up for Him saying at the end of your life, "Depart from me, I never knew you." But Lord, didn't we do this? Didn't we do that? So, on to page 28. Here, finally, the bottom was reached. Perhaps the closest the Catholic Church had ever come to being overthrown, to becoming an apostate body. Historians tell us that probably 8 out of 10 Catholic bishoprics worldwide were, at this point, in the hands of counterfeit Christians. Another historian asserts that the number of the episcopal sees that can be shown to have remained in Orthodox hands throughout the crisis can be counted on the fingers of one hand. The Nicene Fathers had all either fled, been compromised, been imprisoned, or apostatized themselves and joined the enemy. An anti-pope sat upon the chair of Peter and Athanasius, the little man whose little book may have started the whole war, huddled in a cave in the Thebaid desert, sheltered by hermits and goat herds. In short, Orthodox Christian clergy were an endangered species, and this was as close as they have ever come to final extinction. This is that terrible time which St. Jerome later spoke when he wrote his famous words, quote, "The whole world groaned and was astonished to find itself Arian." And yet the laity, the blessed laity, now sheep without a shepherd, as it were, once again prayed their prayers, worked their works of compassion, continued their patient imitation of Christ, and kept on going. They sheltered the heroes, shunned the traitors, protested the novelties, shed their blood when they had to, and clung tenaciously to, quote, "that faith which was once for all delivered to the saints," Jude 1. And they waited for the coming spring. Then there's chapter 2. It's called The Age of Iron, Barbarian Bishops of the Dark Ages. Page 35. The last blow was struck by the Ostrogoths, rushing in from the steppes of the southern Russia. And when the whole enormous edifice finally did come down, the Dark Ages began. The period that followed, from, say, 552 or so, to the First Council of the Lateran in 1123, may be profitably thought of as the age of the apocalyptic church. Movie fans are familiar with the genre, which includes popular titles such as Escape from New York, Waterworld, and the Mad Max films. The famous Catholic historian, Baronius, coined a term for this period of church history that sounds just like another entry in the same category, the Age of Iron. If you've seen some of the movies, you can perhaps imagine what a post-apocalyptic Christianity might look like. And what you imagine, minus the sci-fi elements, of course, wouldn't be far wrong. Quote, "The cities are depopulated, the monasteries ruined and burned, the country reduced to solitude," lamented a synod of bishops, writing at a time near the low point. Just as the first men lived without law or fear of God, abandoned to their passions, so now every man does what seems good in his own eyes, despising laws, human and divine, and the commands of the church. The strong oppress the weak. The world is full of violence against the poor and of the plunderer of ecclesiastical goods. Men devour one another like fishes in the sea. Needless to say, the bad shepherds returned with a vengeance as well. In fact, this is the period of Catholic history from which Martin Luther and the other Protestant reformers drew some of their juiciest, hottest horror stories, their most effective anti-Catholic propaganda. Page 41. Drunkenness was everywhere. Fields went unplowed, and famine returned. Strange apocalyptic cults arose, tempting the people to horrifying superstitions. The process was accelerated by new waves of barbarian invasion. Emboldened by the fall of the Carolingians, the pagan Magyars overran Christian Hungary. Viking pirates raided the northern coasts at will, plundering churches and destroying the flowering Irish monasteries. To the south, Islam grew stronger and stronger, conquering Sicily and Crete, and even establishing a foothold in Lower Italy. What little government existed in Western Europe was now undertaken by local bosses, petty chieftains, coarsened and made cruel by the long conflict with savages. Pretty quickly, these bosses took control of the only thing left worth stealing, the Catholic Church. They could not simply have liquidated church wealth at this point and deposited it all in their own coffers. What was left of a faithful laity would not have stood for it. So they did the next best thing. They put their own hand-picked men into practically every office of the church. The bosses, now doing business under the title of Prince and Baron, began taking money from men who wanted to be ordained. Men, in other words, willing to be priests for a price. Page 44. With Charlemagne gone, the Pope's office was up for grabs, as much as any, and the bosses conspired together to take it in hand. Like the Corleone family gaining the friendship of a city alderman, secular princes elected popes, deposed them at their own discretion, sometimes installed the deposed man a second time, and even murdered several to get them out of the way. So are we now going through terrible times, which I suppose will just continue to get worse and worse? Maybe for my whole lifetime. Yeah, I suspect so. But these stories, oddly, are very encouraging to realize the church has gone through horrendous periods. So far we've only looked at the Arians and then the Iron Age of the apocalypse of Christianity in the Dark Ages. And the book goes on with other periods. I won't read much about the French Revolution, but how just utterly diabolical. kind of maybe the mother of totalitarian regimes of the modern period. But so are we seeing things like China electing the bishops for the Catholic Church and receiving the Pope's rubber stamp. And that was done by the blessing of the Pope? Unbelievable. So, when you see all these horrid things from history, and from the kings and judges of the Old Testament, you realize this has been the whole history. Periodically, diabolical evil controlling, even to the point of it seems all is lost. Imagine Paul on that ship, right? Where everybody was had to go overboard and grab a piece of it, float to safety. Certainly appeared everybody was going to die. All that Paul would be murdered with the other prisoners so that no prisoners escape. I mean, you don't get in much more desperate straits than that. Or, of course, Jesus sleeping at the bottom of the boat that everybody above was convinced was about to be demolished. Jesus was sleeping. He wasn't worried at all. He got up and calmed the storms and rebuked them for their lack of faith. So, the storm is brewing. It's getting worse and worse in the world, in America, in the Catholic Church. And our attitude needs to be, you know what? Been there, done that. Seen it before. It's an old story. Another one of Satan's temper tantrums. He already knows he's losing. We already know he's going to lose. We know the end of the story. Does that mean then that we're not engaged, not involved? Well, that's certainly not what the case was in history, now was it? It was the Christians who helped those who were suffering in the plague in Rome, who started the hospitals. It was the Christians who defended women against all the awful practices of paganism and Romanism. It was the Catholic Church. So, yes, they've always been very engaged. It was the monks who saved, science and philosophy and literature and everything from utter extinction in the West. So, no, this isn't a call for retreating and sticking your head in the sand and not being involved. No, we are involved. Right in the middle of it. Very conspicuously. But not living as they live, believing as they believe. All right, page 49. House servants testified that the Pope practically made the sacred palace into a brothel. They named names. Anna, the widow of Count Rainier. Stefana, who had been his father's mistress. Even his own niece. When he wasn't fornicating, John spent his time shooting dice, fighting duels, drinking heavily, even, with a wink in his eye, raising the glass to the devil on regular occasions. While placing his bets, he invoked the aid of Jupiter, Venus, and other pagan gods. When his confessor happened to witness one of his indiscretions, John had his eyes poked out. The wounds grew infected and the priest died. When another cleric in the palace thought to partake in the fun himself, taking one of the Pope's cast-offs into his own bed, John had him castrated. Another romantic rival had his house burned down. Priests who assisted him at Mass said that the Pope almost never took the sacrament and avoided making the sign of the cross. The Emperor himself testified against his predecessor. That was a pope, a duly elected pope. Well, how can that happen? It must mean the whole Catholic Church then is a fraud. Well, if you're ready to conclude that, I guess you'd have to say that the line of David, the kings of Israel, Israel itself, the whole thing was a fraud, because there were so many evil people in it. Well, then you've just discounted Jesus as the Messiah. So, no, Satan gets into anything that God does. The world. God created the world, not Satan. And Satan came in and horridly polluted it in a variety of ways. Same thing with the Catholic Church. All right, page 64. What Urban had been doing all his life was growing more and more irate against French domination of the church. I should say this is now chapter 3. Resistors of Reform. Clerical collapse in the disastrous 14th century. So again, page 64. What Urban had been doing all his life was growing more and more irate against French domination of the church. As the first pope after Avignon, he was a fiasco. It was like electing Jefferson Davis to the presidency of the United States immediately after General Grant. Urban VI deliberately plunged the church into turmoil at the worst possible moment, fully displaying the madness of partisanship to which the political clergy of his age had become captive. The men who elected him quickly took office out of his reach. Convening again at Anagni, they declared Peter's chair empty because of the duress under which Urban had been elected. Then they chose and appointed another, quote, pope, surprise, a Frenchman, and called him Clement VII. After that, they packed Clement off to Avignon, where they all looked forward to resuming business as usual. When Urban heard about it, he dismissed every single French cardinal in the church and replaced them all with Italians. Clement got word of this and promptly identified Urban as the Antichrist and immediately excommunicated him. This was the beginning of the Great Western Schism, a dumbfounding breach that lasted 39 years. There had, of course, been multiple complaints to the papal throne before this, as we saw so vividly in the previous chapter. Here's the difference this time. Both Urban VI at Rome and the new Clement VII in France, who quickly set up a complete papal court, founding a second line of Avignon popes, had been elected by the same group of men, not by the leaders of competing factions. Page 65. And, in fact, later scholars and canonists did finally prove that the so-called Clement had been the anti-pope at this point, with Urban, for all his faults, the actual successor of Peter. But, as far as public perception went, the damage by these bad shepherds was done, and the grotesque affair seemed, for many, to bring the whole concept of apostolic succession into question, setting the stage for the Protestants to come. Page 78. Alexander V, in whose name the three Hussites were beheaded, wasn't even a pope at all, but one of the French-sponsored anti-popes. Gregory XII was soon deposed by the Council of Constance, and Huss was burned on the authority of John the 23rd, who actually had no authority, since he, too, was nothing but another anti-pope, also deposed at Constance. The killing of Huss, in other words, resulted from a perfect storm of all three of our 14th century catastrophes. John the 23, who is of course not to be confused with the real 20th century pontiff who called the Second Vatican Council, refused the order to abdicate, incidentally, and fled the city disguised as a postman. When he was finally captured and tried for heresy and immorality, he was found guilty on all counts. As the historian Gibbons adds, quote, "The more scandalous charges were suppressed. The Vicar of Christ was accused only of piracy, rape, sodomy, murder, and incest." Then comes chapter 4, the Catholic Protestants, the great 16th century rebels, and those who drove them to revolt. So an important point he makes here is that, obviously Luther and Calvin and the other reformers themselves were Catholic. So they're denying the Eucharist, and all else was the work of Catholics who finally fully broke with the church. But I'm not reading any of the fine quotes in there. So going on to chapter 5, the infamous monster, the church that surrendered to France. And again, this is a wonderful chapter, but I'm not reading much from it, simply because mainly these have less to do with terrible clerics. But I'll read from page 129. Now out of a job, and following the example of their captain, most of the remaining constitutional clergy, they were called, abruptly laicized themselves, and most of them quickly took wives as concrete proof of their defection. More than 4,000 priests, in fact, married, while the total number who, like the Archbishop, renounced their orders is close to 20,000. A good number of them became active, bitter de-Christianizers who willfully assisted Fouché and the rest in horrible sacrilege. Most of the others drowned their shame in drink and gave themselves over to the fashionable new debauchery. And page 132. Here's our last best example of a laity that stayed strong while so many of the shepherds turned bad. Under incredible pressure, in the sight of systematic horrors to make one doubt the very existence of God, the faithful held fast. The constitutional clergymen had been resisted everywhere. The National Guard often had to be called when a new one arrived to take the place of a faithful man. Just as happened in the great Arian crisis of the 4th century, when another crafty minority had attempted a takeover of the people that the people didn't want, most Frenchmen would not even receive the sacraments from priests appointed by the revolutionary assemblies. They preferred to meet underground, to hold fast until deliverance came. What an amazing story of history. We haven't gotten there yet. Who knows how far we're going to go. Right now we have President Trump. He's been very helpful. I didn't believe that he would be elected, so I just went to bed early the night of the election, and my wife wakes me up the next morning saying, "Guess who's president?" And she told me it was Trump, and I thought she was just being ironic, but I didn't believe it. Because I went to the bed the night before just thinking, well, Hillary's going to be the next president, obviously. And when I wake up in the morning, I braced myself for the understanding, the mindset, that this isn't America as I've known it at all anymore. Well, that thankfully turned out not to be true. But President Trump has a election coming up. Maybe he'll lose that one, but anyway, he certainly won't be president after a second term. So, I would say very likely what we'd have from a horrendous backlash and all the insidious censorship we have going on. You've heard of Google China. Well, now I think we have Google America and YouTube and Facebook, all the censoring going on to deceive the masses many of whom just lead busy lives and otherwise aren't well informed. So we get a diabolical leader like Hillary Clinton certainly would have been. Someone of her ilk, or actually probably worse. We better brace for horrendous times. I don't know if it'll get as bad as it did in the French Revolution, but people increasingly are acting irrational, acting under the control of Satan. Lunatics. People that you have to love, pray for, but hard really to argue with. I don't argue with somebody who says he's made of glass. I don't know how to argue with somebody who says that actually he's a woman. So these are the kind of insane times we have entered. And I'm not saying President Trump has been like our salvation or that he's a righteous and holy man, but he certainly has stood against abortion, a diabolical evil, the Molech worship of our day, and Baal worship of our day, demons thirsty for the blood of the most innocent. But his policies for also defending religious liberty, so that I'm not forced to play guitar for a wedding that I don't believe is actually a wedding at all, that I believe actually is diabolical and a slap in God's face, a slap in his institution of marriage since the beginning. But we better brace for it. And the way to brace for it, what is that going to be then? I like to entertain sometimes the idea of having shipping containers arranged on a plot of land and maybe doing it with other friends and having your own little community. No, not a compound. No, not machine guns. No, I'm not planning on withstanding the federal government. But just for being with like-minded people, forming a community that's healthy and much safer. I don't know. Who knows? I mean, if God called me to do that, I'd love to be able to do that. But anyway, that's not ultimately the answer. That could easily be taken over, right? That could easily be overrun. That itself easily could go bad. So that's not the answer. We won't know what we need to be prepared for because we don't know what's coming. You just think a little bit about our artificial intelligence and the incredible surveillance capabilities through social media and our cell phones and everything. And there won't be any escaping this system. There won't be a spot on Earth that's not covered by Google Maps, by satellites. So there's no physically escaping it. There's no physically preparing for it, really. You don't even know what to prepare for. Same thing when you think of transhumanism or of robots or of merging human intelligence with CRISPR and gene editing and artificial intelligence and the brain connected to the internet. I mean, who knows where in the world we're going with the CERN super collider releasing antimatter, and I'm no physicist, but anyway, what I'm saying is that we wouldn't know how to prepare for, physically, a totalitarian regime. Like the sort of thing that happened with the French Revolution and China and North Korea and Vietnam and Pol Pot and on and on. So with this one world government, hippies of the 60s used to call it the military-industrial complex. Now, I don't think that they're so worried about that sort of thing now that they think they've come of age and believe that now they're the architects of this new world order that they're hoisting upon all of us with their, I guess now the term would be deep state. These things sound conspiratorial, because they are, because I believe it is a conspiracy. Do I think that the UN is conspiring more and more to erode borders and nationalism and have a one-world government? Yeah, call me a tin hat wearer, I guess, or a conspiracy theorist, but I'm not stupid, so yeah, I do think that's what they're doing, and if you don't see that, I think you're either stupid or you're a liar or you're, badly ill-informed. But our answer then isn't going to be to run away from this physically or to prepare for it. We don't really even know what to prepare for, and physically there probably is no preparing for it. Money is going digital. Most people just use their credit cards. Your bank account easily could be seized, right? GoFundMe accounts are stopped, and what is called Patreon is stopped, and Crowder is defunded, and on YouTube, and on it goes. So obviously, if you are basically an enemy of the state with all these technological sophistication, it won't be hard to set you up to where you don't have money. Oh, good, you have land, and you're living off the earth. Yeah, well, how are you going to pay your taxes for that land? Whatever other bills come up. So anyway, the preparation has to be mainly, by far, spiritual. Staying out of debt, and hey, if you can't have a getaway that you can enjoy as a lake cottage and maybe end up living there, great. I'm not mocking that. But ultimately, no comparison, the preparation has to be spiritual. The obvious, stay out of sin, right? If you're into pornography or abusing alcohol or, whatever your vice is, get delivered through the power of Jesus. Number 2 is to be filling your mind with what's good, not crap. So sure, stay basically informed, have some idea what's going on. I'm not saying unplug from civilization, but fill your mind with what's good. Whatever spiritual disciplines maybe you use, if it's, reading litanies or novenas or, the breviary or scriptures from the Missal for the readings every day, more regular Mass attendance. Obviously the required Mass attendance once a week, that should certainly be a given, right? But beyond that, and regular enough confession, and to just plain old live a holy life and love those around you, and without even making big statements or wearing t-shirts, more and more, just naturally, if you're living a holy life, you're a freak. We are becoming more and more conspicuous, simply by just what you don't do. Why are you faithful to your spouse? Don't you know so-and-so is interested in you? Yada, yada. Right? All right, page 145. The afterword. Those times of duty have come. A time to purify the church ourselves. A time to tell the clergy reverently to lead, follow, or get out of the way. All the crimes of church history are raising their horrible heads again. Politics in the curia, unbelief among the clergy, unchastity in the seminaries and the monasteries, resistance to reform. And we, the laity of a royal and Catholic army, sworn to King Jesus, cannot go back to business as usual. And that's a book I recommend, Bad Shepherds by Bennett.